y'all. It's not something I used to talk about, but then several years ago, there was a clock lovers association over in Tallahassee, and they invited me over to talk about the clock tower at the courthouse. And so I put together this presentation, and I figured, you know what, I'll show it to y'all and whoever's here and whoever's watching the video. It goes into a lot of detail to begin with about Suwannee County history, because these folks were not necessarily from Suwannee County, didn't really know a lot about us. Yeah. So a lot of the first few slides will be familiar to y'all since y'all are regulars, but maybe somebody watching has not been paying attention. So a lot of history will be a redo for y'all. And then we got lots of pictures and explanations, those kinds of things. So, starting off our early history, as we've already talked about in a few different presentations, Suwannee County was the 37th county of the state of Florida, formed on December 21st, 1858, a part of Columbia County. Suwannee, the word, a couple different ways people think about it, what it means. Some folks say it comes from the Native American word that means echo river, muddy waters, something like that. Another origin in which fits the maps is the Spanish, when they arrived here in the New World, in Florida specifically, named the Suwannee River the Rio San Juan de Guacara, which translates to the river of St. John of antiquity, talking about John the Apostle. So there's a St. John's River in Florida, and then there's San Juan de Guacara. So it could be that they were named after the same person, or it could be they just used that name because it sounded like the Indian name that they had heard it used. But those are a couple different thoughts as to where the word Suwannee comes from. So, again, we were created December 21st, 1858. The original county seat was a temporary seat. It was going to be the house of William Hines. And William Hines was our first county judge. He owned 24 slaves. The only property I found that he owned at that point was in the northwest part of the county, about where Nobles Ferry crosses over the interstate, where Townsend Farms is. So that's very possibly the original location until better facilities could be, purpose-built facilities could be built. And so that within a year or so it happened, and Houston became the county seat for about 10 years. Our first records for the county are dated in the fall of 1859, and they are showing it as Houston being the county seat. The county about that time, right before that, had purchased two 40-acre parcels there, pretty much where the country club is, the golf course is, in that area. And so it's very likely that this first purpose-built courthouse was built on that part of the land, which was close to the railroad track. The first recorded deed in Suwannee County, I think I've mentioned this before, but the first recorded deed in Suwannee County was for the sale of a slave. So we have history, good, bad, or indifferent. So this is kind of a drawing that I kind of put together from MapQuest and such, showing where the original property that William Hines owned was there off Nobles Ferry. And you can see Interstate 10 running east and west, and Nobles Ferry running roughly north and south, just past the curve. There's a curve on Nobles Ferry, so it's just past that. So that was the property that he owned when the county was around. Now, it may or may not have been in this location. We don't know for sure. I have not been able to find it for sure, but this was the property that he owned. So this is as good a place as any. So Houston here was the first kind of permanent, if you will, county seat. And again, we've talked about this before, but elections were held in April of 1859, so they elected the judge of probate, who was the county judge also. They also held elections for the clerk of the court, the sheriff, the coroner, county surveyor, the assessor and collector of taxes, and only 4 county commissioners. So Houston, which was probably a recently established community, became that county seat. Very possible, very likely that it was named after Edward Houston, who was the president of the Pensacola, Georgia Railroad that came through Suwannee County. That one, the one railroad that we had, our first railroad. And it makes sense that they would name the community after the guy that built the railroad upon which the community was built. So, let's see. By 1860, there's a note in some of the old court minutes that we still have at the courthouse, but there is a note in 1860 by the circuit judge at the time, which was James M. Baker. and that's the guy, Judge Baker is the namesake for Baker County. And he stated that a suitable courthouse has been erected in Houston, and so he revoked the order to hold court in the house formerly owned by William Hyde. So by 1860, we've got a purpose-built courthouse built in Houston. Still don't know exactly where that was, because the records of that day are kind of sketchy, not sketchy might be the wrong word, but they're not very precise. We know it was located somewhere on those 40 acres apparently, but the descriptions are very ambiguous. And they use descriptions such as starting at the 3 turkey oaks by the railroad kind of thing. So the markers are no longer here. It was not a section township range necessarily. It was not a so many feet or so many chains this way or that way. It was just starting with 3 turkey oaks and then going this direction. So we just don't have a lot of information about that first courthouse, the first purpose-built courthouse anyway. So Houston became the county seat, but as the Civil War was about to start in 1861, we've got another community that is being established, and it was there about early 1861 on the Pensacola and Georgia Railroad, and it was named Live Oak, or Live Oak Station actually. It was kind of halfway between Cuyler, which was later called Custer, which was about where Mount Olive Road is, 153rd Road is, on the west side of the county. And then also between that house, it's about halfway between those two spots, was a place that came to be called Live Oak. Now there was a place called Spring Grove in the neighborhood. It might have been part of what's now Live Oak, it might have been a little north of it. But then Live Oak was established based around a live oak tree such as this one. This is not it, but based around something like that. And this live oak tree covered a pond, which was by where the railroad was being built. And so the railroad workers would stop and have their lunches at this pond and at this live oak tree. And even before that time, when folks would go down to the Gulf of Mexico to get salt for the year, they would stop at this big tree and this pond, and their horses would drink water, they'd sit and have lunch. And so kind of meet me down at the live oak kind of thing was how it more or less started. By May of 1861, that's the earliest record I can find with Live Oak being mentioned, and it's called Live Oak Station because it is a railroad stop on that newly established Pensacola and Georgia Railroad. William H. Rousseau was our first county senator, state senator. He founded the first Masonic Lodge, and he was the first station agent there for that railroad, and very likely he's the one that named Live Oak as it is. So Live Oak has been established by 1861. Houston is still the county seat. Well, as the Civil War continues, there is this drastic need for a connector line between the railroads in Georgia and then the railroad that is in Florida. And so by the end of 1861, they had picked Live Oak as the location for this connector. And it was being worked on throughout basically the entire Civil War between Live Oak and a place called Lawton, Georgia, which is now DuPont, Georgia. And so they started working on this basically in 1861 and saw the need for it, but because of the Civil War and because of all the various issues going on, it was hard to get enough iron and such to build the line. So it really was not actually completed until a month before the Civil War more or less ended. So it didn't really help the South much, but it did open up Florida for easier access after the Civil War. For the first few years, actually, after 1865, after the war ended, if you wanted to come into Florida by railroad, you had to come through Live Oak, this little community that starts to grow because people stop there and they decide they want to live there instead of going east or west. And so Live Oak begins to grow. By 1866, first post office has been established here, and that was about where the parking lot is for the First Baptist Church. Moses L. Stebbins becomes the first postmaster, and a couple years later he becomes clerk of the circuit court. By 1867, the next year, there are telegraph lines that we have. So not only do we have railroad access, but now we've got communication between us and the rest of the society. And so that allows more and more people to come in. About that same time, 1866 specifically, a man by the name of John Parsley moves from Ohio. He originally was from New York, in Massachusetts, lived in Ohio, in Urbana, Ohio, but after the war he moved down to Florida and decided to move into the little hamlet of Live Oak. He wants to regain a fortune he has already lost. He is big into the timber sawmill industry stuff. So he basically builds a sawmill on the west side of Live Oak, I guess you could say, close to First Baptist Church. Builds the First Baptist Church building, he's Baptist, but he builds all that kind of stuff there. He actually builds his home across the street from where the present courthouse is located, where it's now the bank and some other things. And so he basically sets up downtown Live Oak as we know it today. Because the original downtown Live Oak was over where Houston Street crosses the railroad tracks. So that was the original downtown. That's where the businesses were. That's where the original railroad depot was. That's where his sawmill and stuff was built right next door. Those kinds of things. The post office was right over there. So he built that, and then he started laying out streets along and around his home. So that's why we have an Ohio Avenue named after where he came from. That's why we've got a Howard Street is named after one of his sons. Wilbur Street named after another son. Parsley Street named after the family. A lot of those downtown, what we now consider downtown Live Oak, those roads were named through John Parsley. And his construction of the sawmill and associated industries led to a lot of growth in the area. People were coming in to do that and to work at that. He and his wife, which she was very publicly minded, and some people say she's the one that had the brains and the money sense. They were able to establish a schoolhouse here in Suwannee County, probably one in Live Oak, and had land even for their daughters. Now the sad thing about him is within 2 years, in 1868, he dies. He dies on August 8th, 1868. His wife continues her husband's work for another 30 years before her own death, right before turn of the century. And she's able to provide a lot of property for churches, for schools, colleges, just all kinds of stuff. She was very public-minded and a very business-savvy woman. So they were able to continue that tradition. The week before John Parsley dies, August 1st, 1868, the state legislature in this chapter here that you can see, this act, to permanently locate the county site of Suwannee County and for other purposes. They relocate it from Houston to Live Oak. And Mr. Parsley had a lot to do with that. And I think we've talked about this before, about blackmail and such, involving the clerk of the court and such at the time. But Mr. Parsley was instrumental in getting the county seat moved to Live Oak. And it just so happened that's where he lived, and it was close to where his house was. So it made it real easy. And so August of 1868, Live Oak becomes the county seat. And then basically they were trying to decide where to have the actual courthouse. Okay, Live Oak is the county seat, but where are we going to put the courthouse? And so Mrs. Parsley, because Mr. Parsley has now passed on, Mrs. Parsley proposes a site across the street from her home. And that one is accepted in November of 1868. There's another group of folks, Nathan Walker and Henry A. Wise, that proposed, hey, let's build one over close to where the downtown at the time was, over there by Houston, between Houston and Walker Streets. Let's build the courthouse there. And the county commission went with the Parsley proposal and accepted it in November instead of the one half a mile away over by what was downtown Live Oak at the time. Well, then Mrs. Parsley the next month withdrew her proposal, and the county commissioners accepted the Walker Wise proposal half a mile away, and so they started building on that. Well, in February of 1869, it was determined that the December meeting did not have a qualified quorum of county commissioners because one of them was not eligible. He had not been qualified to serve, and he was removed from office. So they no longer had a quorum, so everything they did in that meeting was null and void. So Mrs. Parsley came back and said, hey, I want to repropose my courthouse spot. In the meantime, the Florida legislature had changed the law. So instead of the legislature deciding where the county seat was going to go, they said the citizens can vote to where it's going to go. Now, one of the stories I read or heard was a lot of the reason they did this was because of Suwannee County citizens complaining about this back and forth as Houston, which part of Live Oak is going to be. And so they had enough people petition the state that the state changed the laws. Now, whether that's true or not, I don't know. I've just read that and I've heard that over the years. So the county commission follows the new policy, the new statutes, and so they authorize an election to be held on March 27th, 1869. There were 6 polling places: Houston, Welborn, Live Oak, Columbus, which is now the Suwannee River State Park, a place called Plowman's, and then also Boston, or New Boston, which was down around what's now Branford and McAlpin, that area, along the river. And the results were kind of inconclusive. It looks like Houston won, 215 votes. The partially signed Live Oak got 168. And then there were another 91 votes for Live Oak, just Live Oak without a location being mentioned. So none of them got a majority. Plus there were a lot of problems with the voting. Things like dead people voting, people voting twice, people not sure what they were voting for. Even the commissioners were not sure what they were voting for. And so they had to re-advertise and have another election. So May 15th, they basically narrowed it down to it's either the partially site or Houston, not the maybe Walker site that some of these others were trying to vote on. And so when the election was held, the partially site was determined to be the courthouse. And so Mrs. Parsley handed over a deed to the county commission. And until a courthouse could be constructed there, they were allowed to meet at the Baptist church for $1 a meeting, and then $2 a day for circuit court hearings. That Baptist church had been built by John Parsley. So that's part of the elections page, where they're going back and forth and stuff. So we've got issues back and forth. There's lawsuits involved because within a couple of years, some folks are wanting to move the county seat over to the old Walker Wise building that had almost basically been completed and was now being used as a school. And so the new Board of County Commissioners, after the one we just talked about, wanted to move over there. So Mr. John Purviance, who is a business owner who now lives in our downtown Live Oak as we know it, close to the Parsley house, sues them. In the meantime, he becomes a county commissioner. So he's actually suing himself by this point. And the judge rules in favor of Mr. Purviance, the citizen, against the county commissioners, including John Purviance, the elected official, that you cannot move it. It's got to be in the same location at least 10 years, if not 20 years if it's a brick building. And so the Parsley site remains the county seat. There's a couple of different things going on. A building has already been moved and blown down. The old First Baptist Church has been moved and blown down. So the county commission, by the end of 1872, they are advertising specifications for a new building. And this building is going to be 2 stories, 5,400 square feet. It's going to cost $8,000, and that is a photograph of the building. And we've got a lot of these records at the courthouse even today, which is why I'm able to tell you how big it was, how much it cost. I can even tell you who occupied which room based on our records that are at the courthouse. But the building was basically completed in 1874. It's accepted by the county commission. They get insurance on it, and the insurance for the building was $90. Definitely not that today. A man by the name of Willis Ball builds it. He's from Tallahassee, served the Civil War, and he builds the building at this point. One of the funny things, and this is a story I tell kids when they come to the courthouse about being careful what they write about or what they write down or post. Mr. Ball was delayed in coming over to work on the courthouse, and so Mr. Purviance, who had become chairman of the county commission by this point, writes him. So Mr. Ball replies saying, "Sorry, I've been laid up for a month with diarrhea," basically. So we still have that letter, that diarrhea letter I call it, at the courthouse, because he wrote it down, and so it's there for all posterity to see. So this building is the new courthouse. It's the first purpose-built courthouse in Live Oak, and it is used for 30 years as the courthouse. Well, by 1904, it's no longer adequate. And so we have a new one built, which I'll talk about in just a minute, but this building is moved from the site because it's the current site where the courthouse is. That is where this one was originally built. It is moved across the street on the corner of Pine Avenue and Wilbur Street. It is operated as basically a boarding house of sorts. It's called the Brown House, the White House. It's finally sold to Mr. Fred J. Green, and he moves it yet again further down on Pine Avenue. Uses it as apartments. And this photo is from 1964 when Hurricane Dora hit. But that is the building, two-story brick building. And then here's the building a few years later, as the back of the picture says, as they're renovating it, but that actually is where they're tearing it down, is what it appears to be. It was torn down in the 1970s. Now, had this happened today, there probably would have been a push to preserve it because of the history. But the 1950s to the 1970s was kind of an out with the old, in with the new, all this postmodern type stuff, and so this was just old junk, let's get rid of it. So like I said, it was used for 30 years as the county seat. Well, by 1903, it's too small. So Live Oak is one of the largest cities in the state at this point, 5th largest city in the state, and the largest inland state in the state of Florida, inland city in the state of Florida. And so we need a newer, bigger, better, more appropriate courthouse that represents better the prosperity of the county. And so this building is no longer good enough. So on November 3rd, 1903, the county commission orders a new courthouse to be built to replace the old one, quote, which has outlived its usefulness. So they're going to build this courthouse on the same lot, the partially lot, and move this one in it instead. They accept plans, oh, I forgot to turn my phone off. They accept the plans of a man by the name of Benjamin B. Smith of Montgomery, Alabama, who was an architect responsible for a lot of buildings, not just in Montgomery, but also a lot of other places. And the builders are going to be R. Hugger and Brother to build the new courthouse, and it's going to cost $41,300 is the proposal. And Mr. Smith is going to get 5% of that as the engineer, or the architect, and also superintendent of the work. So the old courthouse basically is being given to the estate of J.F. White, who had since passed on, with the condition that they move it, but allow the county to use it. So again, it's moved across the street, basically, very close by. There's a courthouse vault, which is a brick vault built for the purpose of storing records. That is given to Connor Bryson under the condition that he erect a new brick building to enclose that and to be used by the clerk of the court until that new courthouse is completed. The closet, as they called it, toilets, is given to the city marshal to be put wherever he wants. So that's kind of all in the county commission minutes, which is fun to read 120 years later. When the new building is, the cornerstone is being laid, county commissioners ordered that all the Masonic lodges in the county attend so they could do one of their ceremonies. And so the cornerstone was laid on February 29th, 1904. So leap year, they do it on that day. And that building only takes about 6 or 7 months. August 1st, it is accepted by the county commission. And so it is still in use 120 plus years now later as a county courthouse. I think the second oldest in the state is still being used as such, if I remember correctly. There's one that's a couple years older, but still being used as a courthouse. So that's pretty good. Has it been expanded? Yes. So our focus is on the clock tower. So from now on, the discussion and all the pictures are pretty much going to be related to the clock house, the clock tower there at the courthouse. So you can see it here in this picture, the white picket fence and all that stuff in front. And so the clock and the tower, the bell there, as it still rings every hour, depending on if the power's been out or not, it may not be the right hour, but it does ring every hour. And it's hard to see in those pictures that I took several years ago. But if you look very closely, you'll see that it says the E. Howard Company, Clock Company. So it was purchased through that company. this is a little bit better. We still have in the courthouse and the clerk's office, we got the original instructions on taking care of it. A little water damage there on the bottom, that happened probably 75 years ago, I'm guessing. But it still tells you how to take care of it. Now, since that point, we've got electricity there and things like that, so they don't necessarily have to do all this, but we still have it because it's historical. But the E. Howard Clock Company, a little bit of history on it. 1842 was founded as the E. Howard Clock Company. In 1861, it was incorporated as the Howard Watch and Clock Company. In 1863, amidst the Civil War, it was reorganized. And then 18 years later, it was reorganized again as E. Howard Watch and Clock Company. In 1881 or 1882, depending on who you talk to, Edward Howard, the original founder, retired. And then in 1898, E. Howard Watch and Clock Company failed. So then they had to do some things, reorganizations. 1900, it re-emerged as E. Howard Clock Company. In 1904, ironically the same year our courthouse was built, Edward Howard died. And then in 1933, it became Howard Clock Products Company Incorporated. And then 1994, 30 years later, 30 years ago, it was purchased by La Crosse Clock Company, so the name kind of is dissolved at that point. So a little bit of the history of it. This clock company installed dozens of clocks and bells around the United States, places like the Ferry Building in San Francisco, the Wrigley Building in Chicago, and even in Florida, they installed places like Pasco County Courthouse. So that they were used by a lot of different folks. So there's another picture of it from 1964, 1965, as there are additions being completed on the sides, the two wings there around the courthouse. So lots of minor repairs, minor renovations for the first 60 years of its history. But by the 1950s and early 1960s, the county commission realizes we've grown enough that we need basically more space. We can't operate in what we've got now. This courthouse is too small. So there was very serious consideration of tearing it down and building something modern, postmodern, Frank Lloyd Wright type junk. Sorry, stuff. I'm not a fan of his stuff or that look. That look. I like the old style, classical type stuff. So forgive me if I just offended several folks there. Frank Lloyd Wright was a great architect. I'm gonna get myself in trouble so many times. But anyway, they were looking at something more modern instead of the old look that this one has. And so they really considered it until they found out how much it was going to cost. And so they realized that's a little too much for us to tear down and build something new. Let's just renovate what we've got. In May of 1963, the board approved the clerk to call Harry Burns and Associates to prepare plans and specifications for renovations and additions. And they accepted it. Within the next few months, in August, they said, yes, okay, let's do that. Now let's try to get some federal and state assistance. And they were able to do that. So in 1964, April 16th, the courthouse additions and alterations was awarded to a company named R.B. Gay Construction Company. And they had to move all the offices out. So the clerk of court, all the county offices, and the judges were moved out to a couple different buildings, some of which no longer exist. Court was going to be held in City Hall, which is now the Chamber of Commerce building. So they began work on these alterations and additions. September 1964, Hurricane Dora comes through, floods pretty much downtown Live Oak. And in some of the aerials that I've got of that, you can see the flooding, but then you can see the partially complete addition to the building. But the water subsided, whatever damage was done was repaired. And so in 1965, let me see the date, April 6th, 1965, the board was asking for revised insurance amounts now that they had a bigger renovated building. So this photo is basically, what I've got is, at the courthouse, I've got a series of photographs at different stages of construction, starting at 0%, 10, 20, etc. And this was at the 100% mark. They were finishing up and they're clearing all the folks, the construction debris away, but the construction is complete. And that shows the courthouse. As you can see, the clock tower is still there and still operating. The main thing about that 1904 courthouse that is different externally is they've removed a lot of the chimneys. See if you can see. Not the best picture, but you can see a few chimneys. They pretty much removed those alterations. And that's pretty much the main thing you can see on the external side, beyond the addition of the wings. So there's work done interior over the years. I know in 79 and 80, I think it was, I got a lot of photographs of some major work done inside. But externally, it pretty much was the same. But then by November of 1998, the courthouse is added to the National Register of Historic Places. So one of about 6 or 8 buildings in Suwannee County that is on that register. And that opens up the county to receiving more grants to help renovate the building, which by this point is almost 100 years old. And so they start doing that. In 2000, the renovations are approved, and the Bradley Construction Company starts work on it after Clemens Rutherford Associates has done the prep work and the architectural designs for these renovations. And so what it involves, if you were to go in there today, you would see a lot of restoration, if you will, to make it look more like it did originally. Old style looking lamps and lighting and glass and things like that, to replace some of the stuff that had been changed out over the last 100+ years at that point. So a lot of work was done. They did some work on the first floor, a lot of work on the first floor actually. They added a second courtroom, because up to that point we only had one courtroom upstairs. They added a second courtroom downstairs, smaller. They also added more hearing rooms, and they did that because the tax collector and property appraiser had moved out a couple years before into a different building. So they had all this open space. When I started it there in 1998, it was basically just open space, empty office space. We used part of it for storage for the clerk's office. But in 2000, they started renovating that to add a few hearing rooms, new judges' offices, circuit and county judges' offices, some space for court administration, and like I said, that second courtroom. So lots of work was done, very extensive. So pretty much from this point on, you're going to see pictures of some of the renovation work and restoration work that is being done. Again, focused on the clock tower. But it didn't need it. Lots of scaffolding. Now, I missed part of this because I was out for cancer. That was the 2000 was I first found out I had cancer. And so I was out a lot with that. So I missed some of this because I was down in Gainesville with radiation, chemotherapy, surgeries, those kinds of things. But a lot of work was done. You can see all the scaffolding as they're going in and look at mortar joints, all kinds of different things. Let's see, make sure I don't miss any notes I've got as we go through. And so you can see here on the left-hand side some of the damage from over the years. You see part of the brick being exposed. You see some of this here being worn. A lot of damage over the years. Now, one of the good things about being up there is there's a great view. So the next few slides are going to be some views, north, south, east, west kind of stuff. So this one is looking south down Ohio Avenue. That one is looking north on Ohio Avenue with Old City Hall / Chamber of Commerce there in the back right. And this one is looking east, Dixie Grill there and beyond. And that one is looking west, I think. Let's see. Let me think. No, that's not. That's the same picture. It's okay. Same picture, different angle. It's like that was throwing me off. Okay. So this was part of the facing, and you can see that it was wood, it was starting to rot. And so they were replacing the facings as part of this process. And that was a major undertaking, getting a crane up there, because I think we're pretty much about the biggest or highest building still in the county, more or less. And so just getting these clock facings, these 4 clock facings off was a major undertaking. Looks like Those are all three maintenance guys. The one holding the crane is Govan at night, looks like, and then the old maintenance director, Steve Sharpless, is in the back, and then that might be Mark Durham there on the right, which is the current maintenance director. So just showing what they had to do to just remove something as simple as removing clock facings and just bringing them down one at a time safely without breaking them, thankfully. And then piling them on top of one another. And they're pretty big. I mean, they're good size. Yes, sir.
What size are those numbers? How tall are those numbers?
Go to the museum and you can see it, because we've got one. We've got one of the clock facings, but those numbers are probably 1.5 feet. Trying to remember, I mean, because the whole facing is basically as high as me or taller. But the corner, we've got one of them at the county museum. When you walk in, it's up on the wall, so you can see it. But it's a good size. It's a good size. But obviously, it's got to be good enough, visible enough to be able to see from the streets, because not everybody had clocks and stuff in 1904. Then we got a bunch of photos of the interior, or back and forth between interior and exterior. This is the interior of the dome, the copper dome at the very top of the clock tower. So you can see that original, in most cases, wood, and how it was set up. It's not how they would build it today, but it's how they built it in 1904. It's going back to the external views. And so when they took out these wooden clock facings, what they did, and you can see it right here, I should have pointed out, that hole is so that they can open it up, and if they needed to wind it manually, they could do that, move the hands a little bit. But they decided it was not worthwhile to keep doing that. It was expensive. And so what they decided to do was replace those with plexiglass. And so that's what they did in 2000, 2001. And so they took all those wood ones out and replaced them with plexiglass. Now, the problem with that is the plexiglass is not always as durable. And so several times since that point, one or more of them have been blown out. Hurricanes we've had, the last year and a half, the 3 we had, I think every time pretty much one of at least of them was blown out. So then that opens it up to the rain and the wind, which then causes issues in the interior of the building. So we are still, I think, waiting for one of them to be fully repaired. Adelia, Debbie, Helene, those things tend to do them in very easily. Bad windstorms. You can see how they were starting to fall apart even then, the wooden ones. So, looking at the interior for the clock itself, the clock mechanism, pretty much everything in there is more or less still original. There's been some additions for electricity and such, but there's a lot of the old original 1904 mechanisms. So this is still there today. I believe this is part of the striking mechanism on the center and the right side, going out that way. But you can see E. Howard and Company, Boston, Massachusetts. So this is still up there today, and that's the original mechanism. There's another view of it from the renovations. And the driving mechanism was replaced by electrical power. So unlike what they originally had to do, originally the county folks, maintenance or whatever, would have to go up every week or two and wind it back up somehow. Since we've got electricity, you don't have to do that. But again, when the power goes out, it means the clock's out. And probably right now, if we were to go there today, it would not say the correct time. They have to get some folks in to do that now. There's part of the transmitting mechanism or the time train there also. And then the next level of the clock tower, you can see the actual striking mechanism, or what a lot of us folks just call the hammer. Since I'm not one of those clock experts, there's the hammer right there on the side. Do not be up there when it goes off. It's very loud. I've almost been up there when it happened. And I happened to see what time it was, and like, we got to get out of here. I've had a tendency over the years, since I've been there at the courthouse, part of my job entails going through records. And I tend to get a lot of summer workers or young workers to work for me. And so they come and go as school ends and whatnot. So I historically tend to take them up before they leave to show them the clock tower to show them all these mechanisms and stuff, and things. So yeah, one time we were about to get our ears hammered with the loudness, but we were able to get down in time. There's a view of the bell, a different view of it. Now that wood has been replaced since then, but lot of history there, and the old brick that you can see. There's another view of it, of the actual clock portion with the facings out. Now the fun thing, and you'll see I think a few more pictures of these, how to get up today anyway. Oh, let me go back. Before these renovations, if you wanted to get up to this clock tower, what you had to do was, on the second floor, there's a ladies' bathroom on the front side of the courthouse. You would have to go in the ladies' bathroom. There would be a ladder you'd have to place, 8 or 10 foot ladder up against the wall. You would then climb to the top of that. There was then a trap door, so to speak, you'd have to push open. And then there would be a gap of about 1.5 feet or so between that ceiling and the floor of the tower itself. So you would have to then get to the very top of the ladder, push yourself through the pigeon poop and pigeon corpses that had gotten there over the years to get onto that the actual clock tower itself, and then climb up basically 3 flights of these rickety ladders, which these actually, it's the original ladders, and they've been added to strengthen with some more modern 2x4 type stuff. So basically 2.5, 3 levels of that, and then you get up to the clock itself and to the mechanisms. So that's how you used to have to do it. When they did these renovations, they changed how to get into that, made it easier for folks. So now if you want to get up into the clock tower, you have to go behind the main courtroom, what used to be a storage room or storage closet, and some of the recording equipment. They basically took a lot of that stuff out. They cut a hole in the ceiling of it, so now they have 2 10-foot high ladders. Basically, you go up one to get to the position pretty much up on the ceiling of that part of the closet. And then you go onto another 10-foot ladder that's bolted on till you get to the point above the courtroom. And then you have to walk across the main courtroom, watching out for all the ceiling beams and the air conditioning ducts and that kind of stuff. Walk through that towards the front of the courthouse, and once you're past where the courtroom is, then you then have to climb down half a flight of the old ladder to get to the base of the clock tower, which is where you come up from the women's bathroom originally. So you go down there, and then you come up 2 or 3 flights of those rickety ladders. So that's an improvement, believe it or not. So I still take folks up there sometimes.
How much you have to pay for a tour up there?
You know what? That's a good idea. I think only one time have I taken a non-worker, and it was because it was a judge's kid or something. So I kind of had to. But generally speaking, it is not open to the public because it's definitely not ADA compliant. It's a hazard because of all the stuff. So generally speaking, it's just workers. And I hadn't even done that in a few years, to be honest. So since my heart issues a couple years ago and pacemaker, it's a little harder for me to do that kind of stuff. I don't want to take the risk of croaking up there and have to drag the body down. So I could do it. It's just be a little slower. But it's very interesting. One of these days, maybe I'll make a video of it. Here's the process. And
There you go.
I should have it for this. But yeah, those ladders, and even with the support on them, the added support, I'm not a tiny person, and I get a little nervous getting on them. So there's some more photographs of the clock tower with the facings out. Kind of just weird. Some of the details, it's amazing, 120 years ago, the detail that was put into this building, and part of the reason it's lasted as long as it was built to last. But all the quality and all the little things. taking out part of the old clock parts. That's another view of it as they're cleaning it. That's part of the transmitting mechanism there that transmits by pole to the four facings. Time train's also there. Just, I mean, it's old. When you go up there, you can definitely tell the age of the building. Just the brickwork and this clock mechanism. These old gears that have lasted for 120 plus years. Let's see. So this one, according to people that know, you can see part of the transmitting mechanism or the time train and the escape wheel, among other features. Now, don't ask me to point them out to you because I don't know what's what. And also the rack tail on the left-hand side. If you were a clock person, you would know what this is. I'll leave it at that. Just seeing some of that old original brick and the wood. There's a view of some of the transmitting mechanism of a time train there. And just how accurate it remains after all these years, except when the power goes out. But barring that, how accurate it is. You know, people would set their watches by it way back in the day. Different views of it. One of the ladders. It's been supplemented with more wood. Yeah. This is a view looking down. Yeah. Today, if you were to go up there, this is at the top. Those are the two flights of ladders. There, you can barely see it. Coming up out of that old closet behind the courtroom. And so where we are right now, basically, oh, and then there's another half little step up here. I forgot another half ladder up here to this point. So basically, I took this picture standing above the courtroom, kind of looking down to the closet. But that's what you have to climb up. It's kind of tight too. I mean, you can see how wide that ladder is. Right there, that's pretty much the only space. So you see some of the power running through. You see some of the piping for the water suppression, the fire suppression system running through. But yeah, I mean, it's kind of tight. Kind of tight. Like I said, a video I don't have, but I've got a few photos. This is some of the things you're going to see if you were to go up there. This is above the courtroom. So you see all the stuff that holds up the roofing. And you see part of the air conditioning ducts there, the big shiny things hanging down. Massive ducts. And then this is at the front, just past the front of the courtroom. Ohio Avenue is up on the top of this photograph. But then there's the half ladder you have to then climb down. You see that opening there at the top right. That leads down to, or used to lead down to the women's bathroom. That was how you would get up. But you see that gap of the wood? See here? And actually there's another gap right there. That's the ceiling of the women's bathroom. So again, a good 1.5 feet or so between that, you'd have to push yourself up. So then you climb up and then you first see the bell tower. That's part of the level with the bell on it. And you see part of the striking mechanism coming down. And then that's another view of it as you're on that level of the clock tower. And then you keep climbing up. And that's another one of those rickety ladders. And that's you looking back down to the level, that half level there. Yeah, I mean, they're really, you see how thin they are. Here's the original ladder, and here's where it's been reinforced. Look how thin that was. Again, I'm not a tiny man. And even with the reinforcement, I'm a little scared. But then you can look up to the next level. And so this is, now you're looking down a couple levels. And this should be the level with the mechanism there and the clock facings. That's that top level pretty much. Different views of that I took a few years ago. And you can see those, that's what actually goes to the clock facings to turn the actual hands of the clock. The universal joint is what that's called, and the rods. And so then there's another flight of ladders that goes up to underneath the dome. And so this is me going as high as I can, taking a photograph down the next level basically to where we just were. So, a lot of up and downs just to get up there, but you can see how high it is. So yeah, the women's bathroom is basically, this window here is the women's bathroom. That's where we used to have to climb. And then you go up all those levels. So the bell is here on this level, then you go up another level, and it's the clock facings. And then you climb up that last ladder I was showing you, and you get up to underneath the dome pretty much. So, lots of modifications and additions over the years. I have allowed the courthouse to keep abreast of changes with population, with government, and the exterior, like I said, more or less looks about what it did in 1904, minus the fireplaces. That's the main thing. There have been lots of proposals over the years since this one was built to still replace it or to build multi-story buildings behind it. I was involved in some of those discussions and plans. And let's see, early 2000s we looked at it, about 2005 or 6 I think. And then a few years later, nothing ever came to it. And I guess that's a good thing because when Trump from Debbie hit in 2012, we had a huge sinkhole behind kind of the courthouse. And if there had been a multi-story building, it would have collapsed. So I was aggravated at the time that the county didn't do it because that would have been a lot of great space for not just the clerk's office, but all the county offices. But in hindsight, I guess it's good it did not happen. So, in September of 24, Helene basically damaged that clock tower, and like I said, some of those facings were torn out and messed up, so we've got repairs, some alterations going on. And one of the issues was, for the first time that any of us know about, the actual copper covering the dome was ripped off. That's how bad the winds were when Helene came through in September. Just like it damaged the museum roof. That's the first time that happened that we know of too. So with that copper that's left being 120 years old, it's very difficult and or very expensive to find something similar. So the county is having to look at potentially changing that out for something else, which is sad in a way, but it's economics. You got to do what you can do. So it's just one of those things. And time will tell what actually happens. We don't know. I know they're looking into it, but it sounds like it may be prohibitively expensive. Insurance would not cover that. So we shall see. We shall see. But all right, that is basically a detailed discussion of the clock tower and photographs and such of it. So next month we'll be looking at farms to factories, which is a presentation I made for the library a few years ago. And it is based on the changing economy in Suwannee County over the years. So I went from farming to factories in some sort, in some senses, and just how technology has changed, how population centers have changed, those kinds of things. So that will be, Lord willing, next month.